Good morning. My name is Brandon, and I'm an alcoholic and an addict in recovery. And today I want to talk about using the term relapse and whether that's really the appropriate term to describe a return to alcohol and drug use for someone in recovery. So, the last couple of weeks, I've been reading and talking about this book, Staying Sober, A Guide to Relapse Prevention, which is by Gorski and Miller and is one of the books that has been extremely important overall in the recovery movement to help with guiding people through relapse prevention. Now, this book was originally published in 1986, and so it's been a good 35 years since the original, or more since the original publication of the book. So a lot of things have changed. A lot of research has gone on since then in the recovery field. And one of my friends in recovery posted a link to an article in Psychology Today about the use of the term relapse, whether or not that's actually an appropriate term to use to describe the return to alcohol and drug use for someone in recovery. And the argument in the article is that the term relapse has a negative stigma attached to it, and that for people in recovery, often relapse is synonymous with failure and is connected very closely with meaning that you have failed in recovery, and that and there are a lot of negative connotations around the use of the term relapse. So this article argues that we need to avoid using that term and choose a new term. The term suggested in the article is recurrence. So the idea is that if an alcoholic or an addict truly has a disease, then return to alcohol and drug use represents a recurrence of that disease rather than a relapse, which a lot of people would view as some sort of failure of the person to do something to continue their recovery. So, just reading a couple of things from the article, it says the term relapse has been criticized and considered less appropriate in depicting the full and therefore correct picture of a person in recovery and their struggles. The biggest issue with the term is that it still carries a black or white dichotomic view of success versus failure in addiction treatment. If the person is sober, treatment is a success. But if they have relapsed, treatment has been unsuccessful. And that's not the case. I know plenty of people in long-term recovery I have mentors in my own recovery journey who at one point in their journey relapsed. Now that doesn't mean that everybody has to relapse along the course of their journey, but for some people relapse does happen and they are still able to go on and live a life in long-term sobriety. So relapse does not mean failure for someone in recovery. In fact, relapse might give somebody an opportunity to go back and look at what was I not doing that I need to do more of this next time. So it might actually help them improve. Now again, I'm not saying that to suggest that people in recovery should go out and relapse because that's going to magically make them stronger at recovery. It's not what I'm saying. But if someone does relapse or have a recurrence and it uses that opportunity to examine what they might have been able to do different to prevent it, then that can be a good thing for their the long-term prognosis of the disease of addiction for that person. So let's talk about viewing relapse as a failure. I think this is really good stuff, because if you go to some groups or talk to some people, they will view relapse as a failure and treat you like something is wrong with you or you have done something wrong. And that's not usually helpful for the person who has actually had a recurrence of their alcohol or drug use. So the article says viewing relapse as a failure can be unhelpful for several reasons. First, it can foster an overly simplistic view of addiction while objectifying the individual struggling with the condition. So I'm going to say that again and try to say it the right way. First, it can foster an overly simplistic view of addiction while objectifying the individual struggling with the condition. So addiction is complicated. Our solutions seem simple, but the actual disease of addiction, it is complicated. And so we don't want to oversimplify it by saying that there's a black and white solution. And we also do not want to objectify the people who are struggling with the condition, because first and foremost, doing so decreases the likelihood that they will recover. That is a critical part of this. The way that we in recovery talk about recurrence can actually decrease the likelihood that people will recover from addiction. So we got to be careful with this. The truth is that a person's work can never be done if they struggle with addiction. It is a condition that requires treatment providers and patients to remain diligent in order to provide the most relevant, up-to-date, and accurate treatment. The common but unrealistic expectation that completing treatment is all that is needed to remain sober can lead to irrational fears around relapse and discourage individuals from seeking help to get back to recovery. Considering that addiction is, in a nutshell, the dysregulation of motivation, having unmanaged expectations and false perceptions can lead to a significant barrier in one's recovery. So I will link to this article in the description of this video. I think it is an excellent article that will help reframe some of the perceptions that we have around what we talk about when we're talking about relapse. And maybe it is time to use a different term like recurrence to describe the condition of someone in recovery returning to alcohol or drug use. Now, when I get back to looking at staying sober, I probably will continue to use the word relapse just because that's the way the book's written. But it's important to note that this book and what the article says we need to do to try to help people in recovery prevent recurrence, they're very similar in that aspect. And one thing I love about this article is it talks about what do we need to do to prevent recurrence, and it boils it down to three things. The person staying involved in recovery-oriented activity, understanding the gradual stages of recurrence and recovery, which is why I'm reading this book, to understand how that recurrence can occur, and then cognitive therapy paired with mindfulness and other behavior-oriented approaches to treating the disease of addiction. So really, really good stuff in this article. I'll link to it in the description to the video. I'd love to hear your comments, but I think that it is important for us to periodically re-examine the language that we use to describe the things that are important to us. In this case, relapse has begun to carry and has for a long time carried a negative stigma associated with it. And maybe it's time for us to use a different term that more accurately describes what's happening without objectifying people who are experiencing it and decreasing their likelihood of being able to return to recovery, because that should be the goal. We want as many addicts and alcoholics as possible to recover, and if we're using language that can be a barrier to that, we need to stop it. So good stuff for today. Very glad I saw this article, that my friend linked to it, and we'll get back to the Recurrence Prevention, Discussed in Staying Sober by Gorski and Miller, to